Wherever you are on your leadership voyage, it starts here.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Leadership Voyage, Season 2, Episode 5. This is a really good one. I think it's going to be something that speaks to almost every single listener. I had a conversation with Peter Hayashida, who is a consulting partner at Martz & Lundy, which is a consulting firm for nonprofits. It's been around for about 100 years. He's a purpose-driven coach, writer, public speaker, fundraiser, an experienced board member, and has a lot of experience to share from 30 years of hiring. We talk about a whole lot today. We talk about job interviews. We talk about managers, culture in businesses, and talk about differences between on-site, remote, and hybrid work. Just a lot of really interesting bits along the way while we navigate those different topics. But before we get into the interview with Peter today, just a reminder that you can go to the show's website at leadership.voyage or reach me, Jason Wick, at startyourvoyage@gmail.com. And please, 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 if there's one thing you could do after listening to this episode, it would be to rate and or review the podcast wherever you are listening, whether it's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or elsewhere. Before we move on into this discussion with Peter, just a reminder about our friends at Instacart, where you can get your grocery deliveries in as fast as an hour. Please make sure to click the link in the show notes and check it out. Your first delivery is free. So without further delay, let's listen to my discussion with Peter Hayashida on Leadership Voyage. All right, welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Leadership Voyage. I am very happy to be joined by Peter Hayashida. Peter, it's great to meet you this morning.
Great to meet you too, Jason. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I'm really looking forward to this, Peter, because as I shared with you a few months back, I learned of you through my wife, who you were her mentor at a summer institute a couple of years ago. And she told me something about you, something you had said there that really has stuck with me. And it was something like, if you managed someone and farther down the line, that person became your manager, the long and short of it, you would think that that was really cool or that was a positive thing. And the humility of that really struck me as something very powerful. And I'm looking forward to hearing how this is reflected in some of our discussions. If I understand correctly, you're a consulting partner at Martz & Lundy, which is a consulting firm for nonprofits, I believe, that's been around for like 100 years, right?
That's right. And
you have a history in academic settings and university as well. And given the anecdote I shared earlier and kind of your career path that you've been on, I'm really interested to hear, what gets you up every morning to go to work?
Yeah, it's a great question, Jason. And I think one that most people should ask themselves, because if you can't come up with a reasonable answer to that question, you're probably doing the wrong job or in the wrong place. So when I graduated from college, I had a communication studies degree and no plan, which I graduated into a recession, as many people are doing today. And that's not an enviable place to be, but it also doesn't close a lot of doors in your mind of what kinds of things you might want to do. But what it does do is create a little bit of a conflict and panic in your mind about how are you going to know whether you're successful if you don't have a destination in mind, right? So I had no bar to pass. I had no CPA exam to sit for. I had no residency to complete. So I had to sort of make up my own set of parameters. And because I wasn't really thinking of a particular profession, I had to dig down to the next level and say, okay, regardless of what I end up doing, how am I going to measure at the end of the day, at the end of my life, at the end of my career, whether I was successful? And I came up with three things. Number one, I want to wake up every day and want to go to work. Whatever the work is, I want to do it. The second thing is I've always been very mission driven. So I really wanted to feel like I was making a difference in someone else's life, making the world a better place, leaving it better than it was when I found it. All of the typical cliches about people who follow their passion. At 22 years old, I believed it all, and it was important to me. And then the third thing was, I'm just a voracious learner. I love learning things. I love reading. I read every day. I do a lot of writing, and I really wanted to make sure that whatever I did offered me an opportunity to continue learning all the time. This plan is flexible. It's not constrained to any sector or job, and it hasn't changed over my career. I still measure my satisfaction and my sort of professional effectiveness based on whether those three criteria are met. And I'm fortunate in that it gave me early insight into my own values that helped guide my career in ways that made the best use of my interests and talents, but also was able to bring some value to a few different organizations.
What a great answer. Thanks for sharing all of that, Peter. Boy, it does strike me as a wise move at 22 years old, though, to really stop and reflect. And as you said, maybe the circumstance pushed you there a little bit, but you really thought about those three things. Thanks for sharing those. What I'm going to do today, and this is kind of cool, I don't know that we've done this on the show yet, but it's going to be kind of a buffet style of questioning as I'm saying it. For those of you who aren't familiar with Peter on LinkedIn, Peter, one thing I love is how you're posting consistently. You just referenced that your third principle, if you will, or value, whatever you want to call that, as you mentioned, is voracious learning, and you're reading all the time. Every week, it seems, if not more often, you're posting an article on LinkedIn, providing an in-depth commentary from your own perspective that complements this story. And what that's done for me, and will be to the benefit of all the listeners, is you have gotten involved on many different topics that I think could be relevant to many listeners out there based on what they're going through in their professional lives. Anything from job interview to company culture to hybrid work. And what I like to do is just walk through the buffet today and grab a little bit of each thing and let's see where it goes.
Sounds great.
So let's start with the job interview process. I personally work in the tech sector, and a lot of folks in the tech sector are getting laid off. And I'm sure many of us are going through job interview process or seeking employment. You posted a little while back about excessive number of job interviews and some other things that are going on in the process of looking for work. And I'm wondering if you could help us out a little bit from the perspective of someone who is seeking employment, from the perspective of an applicant. What are some of the red flags that we should maybe be looking out for throughout the application and interview process?
It's a great question, and one that I think any candidate who's searching for a job should ask first, because the question really becomes not what am I going to do, because you could probably do the tasks you do at lots of different organizations. The question is the organization going to be well aligned with your values? Is it going to be the right cultural fit? Are you going to be surrounded with people who challenge you and make you better? And are you going to be reporting to someone who's as interested and invested in your own growth as they are in your success professionally as it contributes to the team? And I think I've learned a lot of what I know about this topic as a hiring manager for 30 years, more so than as a candidate. I don't tend to move around that much professionally, so I don't interview a ton, but I interview lots and lots of people. And that has helped me come to the conclusion that you will rarely be treated better by your potential employer than you will as a candidate. And so if your experience as a candidate is characterized by a disorganized, unprofessional process, a lack of consistent communication or responsiveness, indirect or non-answers to questions or deflection, a lack of transparency or candor in the interview process, it's a pretty good indicator, actually, that there are probably some things in the culture that aren't working at 100%. And that's just something you really need to take into consideration, because the only thing worse than not getting the job you really wanted is getting the job you thought you really wanted and finding out it's a different job. The other thing I would say is, the hardest part about interviewing for jobs is the same. It's the same advice they give people when they're buying houses, right? Don't fall in love with a house, because there will be another house, and that house may not end up being your house. But there's a level of healthy objectivity you can bring to a job search process that allows you to step back and say, okay, this feels like the opportunity of a lifetime, but the fact is there are no opportunities of a lifetime, right? And if I don't get a job, self-servingly, I just decide, well, it was someone else's opportunity of a lifetime, but not mine. I also think that given the number of people who are partnered or married in the world, if there were only one perfect person, finding them in a world of 8 billion people would be pretty challenging. So I think it's reasonable to say that you find a job that fits well enough, and then you work really hard to make it work for you. So I think those are the kinds of things I would say as you go into a job. There's a lot of tactical, logistical kinds of things like, be prepared for the obvious questions. What's your biggest failure? What's your biggest weakness? Tell me about a time when you were in conflict and you had to get out of it, and what did you do, and what were the circumstances? Lots of places are going to behavioral interviews now, so have an example for every answer. Never, ever, ever, and this, I was shocked at the number of times this happened to me. When you get to the end of an interview and you ask a candidate, do you have any questions for me? And they say, no, I don't. To me, that just shows a lack of curiosity. And in my work, curiosity is really important. It's what drives our success when we engage with donors, when we engage with other stakeholders. So I think those are the kinds of things that you can sort of Google interview preparation, and you'll get a lot of that kind of stuff. But, really internalizing that and making that a part of it's not just a list of lists. What it is it's a sort of integrated model in your head, a cognitive model of how to approach the situation so that you're interviewing them at least as hard as they're interviewing you.
Thanks so much for all of the answers, Peter, and for the depth for each one. I think, I don't know how well I'm representing folks, but my guess is in some cases, someone loses their job and maybe panic it could set in, right? And I think what you're introducing into the process here is, as you said, a healthy objectivity, a level-headedness, a proactive thinking, not just finding a job. So let's run down the list again. You're saying it's likely that if I'm interviewing at a company, that this experience of being interviewed and being the applicant is probably representative of the best I will be treated, or something in that area. That having a healthy level of objectivity is important. I love how you drew parallels there to looking for a house or finding a partner. It's not likely just one perfect fit for you in your situation. And behavioral interviews are definitely more common than they've ever been, it appears, and that be prepared for examples with those questions that you're going to get, biggest failures and so on, and come prepared with questions about the place you are interviewing with, because you were interviewing each other. Yeah,
that's right.
Beautiful. Now, if we switch to the other side, as you said, you're coming with most of these insights from being a hiring manager of 30 years, which is a lot of experience. A lot of people out there are probably hiring or working in organizations that, maybe they're not perfectly involved in hiring, but they're tangential to the process. From your point of view and from your experience, what are the characteristics of a good search committee?
Yeah, that is a tricky question, and one that I think has to be culturally, contextually appropriate. The purpose of using a search committee, the greatest value in my mind of using a search committee is diversity of perspective. And the more people you have involved in a committee, the less likely you are that an individual is going to sway the process with some kind of unconscious bias, right? Women don't write code well, so I'm not going to hire a woman. Well, that's A, and it's not true. And B, if you have enough people around the table, you can balance that perspective with the perspective of others who perhaps have a different lived experience. So part of this for me is you need a hiring committee that doesn't all sort of think, act, and breathe the same way. And so there are people who come to our work in advancement from lots of different directions. We have certainly people who do the kinds of things you'd find in many businesses. Accounting, the gift processing function is very similar to functions that are done in other industries. And then you've got frontline fundraisers, who some people call analogs to sales, which I actually react a little negatively to, but there's a sales element, there's a marketing element, there's a communications element. In my world, the alumni engagement people have to be a little bit of everything. They have to be event planners, they have to be volunteer managers, they have to be programmatic creators. But all of this really speaks to the value of having that breadth of people. At least in my organization, we were broad enough that we could bring a group of people together who came with their own sets of notions and ideas about what might make for a good candidate. Now, I will say that before you even create a search committee, one of the things that I think is really important is to define what the job is and make sure everybody in the search committee understands and agrees on that description. Because the worst thing that happens is you get into an interview with a committee and it becomes clear to the candidate that people either don't know or have disagreements about what the job actually is. That's not a good sign for a person who's looking for a clear path towards success in their new job. One of my favorite questions from candidates is, what does success look like in this job? What does it look like at 1 year, at 3 years, at 5 years? And I especially like the way that's framed because it implies that they might want to stay. The people who are on the committee need to be fully present and participatory. So if someone is not carrying their weight on the committee, they're not showing up to meetings, they're not being engaged in the process of developing a set of questions. That's a problem. It's a problem because part of this is a buy-in exercise as well. The other reason for using search committees is so that there are lots of people, when the person starts on the first day of the job, there's a whole group of people who came in contact with them before they were hired, who can attest to their skills, their fit. They were the right candidate. We saw all the candidates, and this was the best one by far, right? If the organization is large enough, my preference is to not have the hiring manager on the committee.
Interesting.
Because so my role at UCR, I only had 4 division heads reporting to me, and then I had someone who did administrative support. And so most of the positions, there were 130 people in the organization, most of the positions didn't report to me. But it was my practice to interview every finalist for every job at every level. And there were a few reasons for doing that. One of which was because I wanted to sort of make sure that the search committees we were using were giving people the right depth of understanding of our culture and why it was so important, that they understood from me, they heard from me what my vision was for the organization and what values I expect from all the people on the team, and that they have a chance to really, and candidates don't always get this chance, to ask the person who makes the decisions what makes them tick.
No, that's cool. And thank you for all of those answers, Peter. And when we talk about the last anecdote you were sharing, that's when you were vice chancellor at University of California, Riverside. Is that right?
That's right.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So on the committee, we're talking about, first of all, we're talking about we need some shared alignment around what this job actually is. It almost sounds silly to say it out loud, but I'm sure it happens. Yep. We're sitting in the room, and over here, this person thinks this job is this, and over there's someone who thinks it's something else. Great thing to not take for granted. Taking advantage of diverse perspectives, having on that search committee, you said as well. And I really loved when you're talking about, you said 130 folks at Riverside, all in your department, advancement, right? Mm-hmm. You're saying you interviewed personally anyone for every role that came in there. Is that right?
The finalists, sorry.
Yeah.
Yes. And usually it would be 1, but sometimes it would be 2 because the committee couldn't make up their mind or the hiring manager couldn't make up their mind. And they had 2 very close candidates, and they would have me interview both and say, what do you think? And by the time someone gets to me, I assume that they know how to do the job, right? That's what the earlier stages of the process are designed to do. Yep. My role in this is to assess the fit. Right. And when I say fit, I don't mean cultural fit, because that can be code for bias and all kinds of things. I mean their fit with the values. Are the motivations that they bring to the organization the kind of motivations that will make them successful? So people who are motivated and excited by collaboration loved working in our organization because collaboration was in our DNA. People who liked being the star or the sort of the Lone Ranger, they didn't like it so much because they didn't get so much individual glory. They had to share it with other people. And so really conveying those nuances of our culture allowed people to self-select out sometimes. And there were times when we made offers and people declined them, or when they withdrew their candidacy after interviewing with me. And I never took that personally. I just assumed that people are collecting information along the way. And at any point they may decide, maybe this isn't the right job for me. Maybe this isn't the right place for me.
Better to find it out then, right?
No kidding. For all of us.
For all of us. Thank you. You mentioned something a little bit earlier in some of this interviewing process for a candidate. It's important to be at an organization kind of where your values are aligned, where you're going to enjoy the work, and where you have a manager that's invested in your growth. Mm-hmm. A question I'd love to ask is, what's your take on, I don't know that I have the quote perfect here, but there's a saying that's something like, people don't leave bad jobs, they leave bad bosses. I think the reality might be all of the above, but I really would love your thoughts on that saying. What do you think of the saying, people don't leave bad jobs, they leave bad bosses?
Well, I think the saying, like many of these sayings, is a shorthand that probably overgeneralizes. But the caution from this quote is really about not underestimating the impact of a direct supervisor on an employee's engagement, their satisfaction, their ability to be successful, and their loyalty to the organization. Because those are all things that really, if you think about who impacts your life most on a day-to-day basis, you tend to have a lot of contact with your coworkers and the coworker who makes decisions about your performance evaluation and promotions and raises. If you feel like you have a good rapport with that person, you trust them, it's easier to feel and imagine yourself being successful over the long run than if they're the kind of person that isn't really looking out for your best interests. And I do think in that sentence, you have to sort of qualify what the word bad means, because bad means different things to different people. Sometimes the boss is just not well trained or hasn't been coached on effective management. And I actually believe anyone can be a more effective manager if that's what they want to do. I think there's a problematic aspect of many professions where the only way to get promoted is to become a manager. And that's a podcast for a different day. But in this case, I think the question is, if they're lacking training, does that make them bad? Or does that mean the organization has to be accountable for creating a better ecosystem for good management practices? And sometimes change happens and an employee just doesn't feel aligned with the values or the goals or the direction anymore. That can lead someone to leave. And I've seen that happen, not because the changes themselves were inherently problematic, but because the communication about the changes was inadequate or incomplete or inaccurate. Sometimes it's because they feel that no one ever asked their opinion before the change happened. Sometimes it's because the change actually represents an opportunity for them to go do something else that they wanted to do. So, during the pandemic, a lot of people left their banking job and went back to become a ceramicist. I mean, those are the kinds of moments, those stressful moments when you think to yourself, is this really what I want to be doing for the rest of my life? And if the job doesn't feel challenging, if it doesn't feel engaging, if it doesn't feel rewarding, you may move on. And in those kind of cases, I always say no harm, no foul, right? If someone really has a passion that they want to pursue and it's not what the job that they're doing for me, I think they should go do what they want to do, because ultimately there's plenty of people, right? I mean, we've got millions and billions of people around the world who can do jobs. And the question really for an individual is, if you only get, one go at this in terms of a career, there's a mistaken impression that whatever I start, I have to stick with because I've already invested all this time and energy in it. Well, that's an economic concept called sunk cost, right? You're not going to get it back by staying and being miserable, but you might decide it was worth it if you end up someplace where you really want to be. I also feel there's an interesting concept. So when I went to my last job, it was a challenging set of circumstances when I came in. I was the 7th vice chancellor in 10 years. Oh, wow. I had about 89 budgeted staff positions. A third of them were vacant. And a lot of that was because people just got demoralized and tired of waiting. The people who were there were very committed, very devoted. Each brought their own set of talents. But, you do get a little tired of wondering who the flavor of the month is going to be and how that's going to affect your daily work. But there's also an element where I think people feel that if they get into a job and then the job changes, that's not okay, right? That I'm entitled to the job I took 17 years ago, whatever it might be. And I've never seen that work very well. I think there are 3 things that I try to focus on particularly when I'm coaching young professionals. One of them is self-awareness, which I think is the Achilles heel of virtually every person in the workplace, because I've never seen a termination happen for other than budgetary reasons where the person wasn't shocked. No one told them that there was a problem. And I think in some cases that's true because the manager was not competent. But I think in many cases, the signals were all there and we see what we want to see. The second thing is you've got to have environmental awareness, right? So when things happen around you, I went through 3 CEOs at my last institution and I reported to the CEO. So, with each of those changes, I had to have an awareness of what that meant for the university, for my organization, for my relationship with my boss. And then I had to do the third thing that I always emphasize, which is examine how much adaptability I can and want to exert to get through the situation, right? And in some ways, I see adaptability as the intersection between self-awareness and environmental awareness, right? Because if you don't want to or can't change, and the circumstances are changing around you, that's just a recipe for disaster. And it's okay if you don't want to be there anymore. If the place has changed enough that you don't want to be there. I always used to tell people there's 3,000 or 4,000 colleges and universities in the country. If you want to stay in higher ed, there's lots of choices. If you don't want to stay in higher ed, there's even more choices. So, what I encourage people to do is think about why you're doing what you're doing. What's your motivation? What's your long game? Where do you want to be in 5 or 10 or 15 years? I don't mean a job title. I mean, how do you want to feel about your work? How do you want to feel about what you've accomplished? What kind of stories do you want to be able to tell your kids about what it was like to be a working professional? And sometimes I've encouraged people to start looking for other opportunities, even if they're good performers, because they feel stuck, right? They feel like I've gone as far as I can go. I don't see my next step. I don't know what to do. I can certainly keep them around for a few years by investing in them, coaching them, preparing them. But at the end of the day, I have to ask myself, and they should ask me, what are you preparing me for? And sometimes I'm preparing for someone for something that neither of us can see at that moment. We don't have access to that. But we know enough about it that we can start working in the direction of building specific skills and garnering specific experience so that they can be more competitive at whatever it is they're going to do next.
Boy, in all of that, you might have hit 2 more podcasts worth of content topics. I'm kind of just speechless at this point. You hit so much stuff in there, Peter. That's great. When I put together the show notes, I'll make sure to glean as much out of that as I can. What a great answer as far as starting from the the employee-manager relationship and all these different parts that are relevant. And I think what I'm hearing from you amidst all of it is a strong relationship where you're candidly talking about what are we preparing for and just working through that in an honest way together, which I love. Let's switch topics a little bit, although I guess they're all related. Company culture, which I find a fascinating topic because maybe to leaders of the organization, company culture is the 5 values they print on the wall, right? But we all know that kind of, however you want to articulate it, company culture is something about what it really means to work in this company as a human being. I don't know exactly what that definition is, but you posted about this as well. A lot of people are out there in a lot of different work situations. I don't want to focus on the negative, but the question I'm going to ask is a negative framing. What does a broken culture look like? If I'm working somewhere, what are some things I would see that indicate to me, oh, this place is not great?
Yeah, that's an important question, and one that I think a lot of people are facing, especially now as the workplaces start to realign around some of the practices and lessons we learned from the pandemic. First of all, so the way I define culture is it's basically the set of values, practices, norms, rituals that define the soup that we all live in when we go to work, right? Mm-hmm. So it's really that the air we breathe, the water we swim in. It's hard to define, but you know when it's working and you know when it's not, right? And I think when I think about a car being broken, for example, the systems in the car aren't working together, right? Whether it's the transmission or the radiator or whatever it is. I'm now dating myself to an internal combustion engine, but being able to figure out what it is that's not working for us is the most critical thing. So when someone says, I work in a place with a really toxic culture, one of the first questions I have, because it fascinates me, is what does it mean? What does it look like? What are the behaviors that you observe or the words that you hear that define that culture for you as toxic? Because one person's toxic might be another person's thrilling and exciting. You never know. I don't like to take for granted that I know that or that everybody else shares my own values. But as you think about the kinds of things that tend to be patterns for employees in the ways that they feel dissatisfaction, you come up with some common denominators: a lack of trust, a lack of transparency, a lack of accountability, right? One set of rules applies to the senior people, one to the junior people. one to the people in a certain function, whether that's engineering or marketing, and a different set that applies for accounting or HR. I think that poor communication is a common denominator of all of those, because ultimately we don't read minds. So we need to have clear sets of messages and guidelines as we go through our work, partially because we need to know what we're doing, partially because it just gives us comfort. But if you ask people, where is the communication problem in your organization? You shouldn't be surprised to hear someone say, you know what, information flows right down to my manager and then it stops, regardless of what the level of the person is. I mean, I think people feel like there's information floating around that I should have that people just aren't giving me. Whether that's true or not, if people feel that way, that's a problem. I think in today's workplace, because life is so complex between supply chain problems and remote work, that there is a set of unclear and shifting expectations that people have a hard time keeping up with. And it's the responsibility of managers to really kind of keep realigning those two, the expectations and the understanding of the ecosystem in which we're doing our work. That's got to be clear to the employee. Otherwise, you feel like you're chasing something that's kind of ethereal and you don't really know what success is going to look like. When I was growing up in organizations, one of my biggest frustrations was an unwillingness or a discomfort by leadership of confronting conflict. Conflict happens in workplaces, but if you ignore it, it doesn't get better, it gets worse. And so figuring out if there's underperformance issues, how do you address that in a way that doesn't completely destroy the morale of everyone around them, right? Someone who's a rainmaker, who is rude, inconsiderate, not a team player, doesn't get involved in the success of the team, is not going to be successful in my organization. That doesn't mean they can't be successful someplace else, but that's just not how I like to build organizations. And then the last category I would say is the category of what I call playground behaviors: gossip, backstabbing, manipulation, bullying, harassment, passive aggressiveness. These are all the kinds of things that I think inevitably happen when you get more than two people together, and you've got to figure out how to deal with them in a grown-up way. These are like battles, people who have wars on email. Occasionally, someone would copy me on a thread where things were starting to intensify, and I just couldn't help myself. I had to reply all and say, this email thread stops with this message. I want you and you to come by my office, and we're going to talk through this, and we're not going to leave until we've figured it out, because what I don't want is for the emails to be the only form of negotiation or moderation of conversations. And then, of course, the last thing, which, there's so much popular culture right now that's dealing with things like being in cliques, the mean girls syndrome, marginalization, leaving people feeling left out of work engagements. I think that's a problem. It's a problem not because we can fix it in that sense, because I think people tend to gravitate towards people they have something in common with. But we have to create a situation where even if everybody's not best friends, that people don't do things that knowingly make other people feel left out, because it just doesn't create the kind of trust you need in order to have really good collaboration and really excellent outcomes.
So you did point out a lot of potential symptoms or examples of where maybe one person's definition of they're in a toxic culture, perhaps. I mean, I like your example. I don't know how comfortable everybody would be with it, but I really do like your example of this email thread ends now. Let's talk it out. Making a broken culture healthy obviously doesn't happen in a week. What are things that leaders or managers, however we want to think about it, what's a step I can take today to get a little bit better with what's in my control, right? To help in the spirit of making our culture just a little bit healthier.
Yeah. I think, let me just say that I think that there's two kinds of leaders. There's the big L leader who is nominally responsible for the team. And then there's the little L leader, which I believe everyone needs to be. And that, when I say that, what I mean is that culture is not something that happens by dictate. It's something that is an unspoken or maybe spoken agreement among a group of people that we're going to all abide by the same set of standards, behavioral standards, values, whatever it might be. This is not groupthink, right? This is not we're all going to agree on everything. But when we disagree, we're not going to name call. We're not going to make people feel shamed. We're not going to make the personality the issue. We're going to stay focused on the topic. So what I would say is whether you're the titular leader or whether you're a leader in the sense that you want to help move the culture to something that's more healthy, I think we all have to model the desired behaviors, right? So I can't, as a leader, big L of an organization, I can't have one set of standards and behaviors for myself and then a different set for everybody else, because that's the quickest way to send a clear message to everyone that it's actually not about healthy. It's about healthy for me and not necessarily healthy for you. I think then you need to the extent that you're in a role to do so, create incentives for others to come along, to be more focused on the kinds of healthy things: transparency, openness, supportiveness, the collaboration. That requires clarifying values and then explicitly operationalizing them in your processes, your procedures, your norms, whatever might sort of be the governing processes of your organization. And so really thinking about that in an intentional way. So it's not culture is just what happens when you throw a bunch of people together, but it's throwing a bunch of people together and saying, as a group, what kind of a culture do we want here? And now, obviously, with that question, you're not going to ever get 100% agreement. And someone has to say, okay, this is the culture that I believe we need to create because I think it's going to give us the greatest outcome. And then ask for feedback, right? So for me, I had a very clear set of values that people got tired of hearing about, could probably repeat, right? It's excellence, integrity, accountability, respect, and collaboration. I would say that to every candidate when they interview with me. I would say it constantly in the context of the work that we were doing. But that then creates a set of expectations for my managers that they will reinforce those behaviors. And then they ripple that down to their work teams to make sure that across the organization, people understand that these are the standards by which we operate. So when there's a question that comes up where we might have a bad outcome to a particular project, the first inclination is not how do we cover it up? The first inclination of who needs to know first so that they can help us figure out what the message looks like. I think we have to confront bad actors and actions. We can't just let those kinds of things fly. I did a post recently about sort of how you react when someone says something that offends you at work. It requires an enormous amount of courage to say things like, gosh, that really hurt. Or, the author said, sometimes the most effective response is the most automatic response. Ouch, right? Or, gosh, I know how much such and such really matters to you. What I just heard you say, I must have misheard because it doesn't seem aligned with what you've said before. Giving people a chance to, respond with grace to say, oh, that's not what I meant at all. And then the last thing for me is I feel like we have to all practice respect for each other. And I think in today's America, that's a hard thing to do because of so much political divisiveness. We have to be non-defensive because if we're not open to hearing feedback, we're not going to get it. And if we don't get it, we can't get better. And then I think we have to show compassion for each other. We don't know what's going on in people's lives. I spent a lot of time during the pandemic going to bed every night, worrying about whether people are getting sick, worried about whether their spouses were losing their jobs, worrying about whether their kids were being okay on Zoom school. Those are all things I have no control over, but that sense of compassion I felt for what they were going through. I personally don't have kids, so it wasn't affecting me. My spouse is retired. So, there are all kinds of things that I feel like I was in a position where it was more incumbent on me to give people grace, to show compassion, because the focus of my energy and attention was really taking care of my team. And if you don't feel that way and can't feel that way, I don't think you should be responsible for groups of people.
Let's hit one more question, Peter. You're giving us so much to think about, and I really do appreciate all the things we were going through there with culture. You're hitting on a lot of what I would just say, humanness, and I love that. Respect, empathy, compassion. I don't know if we could ever have too much of that. So thank you for saying all those things. We've got this economic outlook that's very confusing, right? Unemployment's super low, but there are a lot of tech layoffs, inflation. When we have all of the stuff going on, it strikes me that, as you've kind of said, communication and organization is paramount. It's more important, probably as important as it's ever been. I don't know. I haven't been alive that long. But looking at on-site, remote, hybrid, do you have any strong opinions, either just your own or data-based, that suggest the strong benefits or drawbacks to any of these type work configurations? Because it really does seem to be an interesting topic, and I'm sure in hiring it is as well.
Yeah, it's interesting that we had this extended experiment on remote and hybrid work that we would not have had but for a global pandemic. And many industries that would have sworn up and down in 2019 that this is not a model that would ever work in our industry, unless they're in hospitality, on-site hospitality, or a similar kind of function that can't be done in some less human intensive way. I'm not sure that they would have even imagined the kind of restaurants I could get carry out from was just amazing. So that was a silver lining of the pandemic. You know, I think that none of these three approaches is perfect, and I don't think this is a settled question, even in some of the most sophisticated organizations. And part of that is that there really isn't enough history and enough research that would that there. And by the way, before the pandemic started, there was research on hybrid work. It wasn't very plentiful, and it was largely ignored by the business community because it wasn't relevant. Those who were interested in it went and did it. Those who weren't interested in it didn't. The question now, though, becomes how do we create a path forward that gives employees a greater sense of predictability, that gives them the flexibility that is required often to retain high performers? I think on-site work is great for building camaraderie, collaborating in real time, nurturing trust. But the added financial and logistical complications of that, commuting, dry cleaning, eating out, plus all the distractions of being in an office are problematic for a lot of people. I certainly have friends who are extreme extroverts for whom the last 3 years has felt like purgatory. But the truth is, if you have that human variation, that richness in your work environment, nothing you do is going to work for everybody anyway. I think remote work brings benefits that we as a society probably never even imagined. Better focus. There has been research on people being more productive when they work at home. Now, I'll tell you, since the pandemic started, there's been a branch of that research that's trying to look into, are people getting more done because they're more focused or because they're working longer hours, because there's not a ritualistic 5 o'clock stand up and go home. But it is clear that it's more flexible, that it's less onerous for caregivers, whether they're taking care of children or elderly relatives, whatever it might be. There is that quality of life issue that was impossible when you were expected at a desk and your productivity was managed by how long you sat in that chair between 8 and 5. I just think that that has created a crisis of management and leadership, because you have managers who don't know how to measure productivity any other way. And you have leaders who don't know how to define desired results in terms of the characteristics of the outcome rather than the process of getting there. Now, certainly being in a for-profit environment, you have clearer indicators of whether the corporate goals are being met. But if you're in a social service agency, certainly there's an element of how many clients are you serving, how effectively are you serving them. But there's still this question of, where do you do it, right? If you're doing teletherapy became huge, telemedicine became huge. So there are things that we would have never imagined receiving in that framework that we now do. I'll also tell you that for people who are historically underrepresented in the workplace, women, people of color, there's a lot of self-report of fewer microaggressions, right? So they feel like if they're working from home, they don't have to hear the snarky comment at the water cooler. And what benefit does that have for mental health? And are there other ways to address that rather than having everybody work from home? Because my biggest fear about remote work is that there is a visibility bias in the workplace when people start talking about promotions and special projects and additional responsibilities, the people we see every day tend to be the ones we think of first. And I worry about especially early career employees who say, I'd be happy never working in an office again. Perfectly legitimate choice, and comes with consequences. There are some rules to the game, and that if you want to play the game successfully today, it's going to look different than when millennials and Gen Z are running organizations. I hope millennials and Gen Z are able to fix some of the intractable problems that my generation and those before created. But I'm just not sanguine that humans change quite that quickly. I also feel that the remote work can feel a little isolating. So people are just out of the loop. They don't hear about things in the same organic way they might hear about them walking down the hall and someone says, oh, did you hear such and such is leaving? Oh, really? Where are they going? You don't actually hear that stuff until later. There's also this decreased sense of commitment to the organization, right? The workplace becomes a commodity. If you're working from home, who cares where you work, right? You just want to make the most money and you want to be able to hold down a job. It's harder to make sure everyone stays on the same page as a manager because they're having asynchronous conversations with each other as opposed to sitting in the same room and realizing when a miscommunication happens. Hybrid might be the best of both worlds if it's implemented thoughtfully, and that means you have to synchronize the in-office time. You have to set up rules and expectations for hybrid meetings so that the remote participants don't feel left out. And then the last thing is just a really practical one, which is as managers, when the pandemic happened, the lockdown happened, we had to think about the million logistical questions, right? Where's their equipment? Where's their workspace? Do we have shared workspace or permanently assigned workspace? I want to go back to something you said at the beginning, which is about layoffs. Not everybody has the luxury of staying calm and objective during a layoff. Likewise, not everybody has a luxury in a hybrid situation of having access to a printer at home, of having high quality Wi-Fi. Who pays for the Wi-Fi, right? There's all those kinds of things that I think if we're going to fix this problem for good, and when I say for good as possible for the time being, we're going to have to answer a lot of those questions because those are the questions employees want to know. And with a 3% unemployment rate, we better answer them now because the political capital we build today is going to prevent people from leaving tomorrow. And that's the biggest problem, at least in my industry, is this constant turnover that is not good for a business that's based on building relationships.
Yeah, thanks for saying all of that. And also thanks for throwing in the bit about not everybody has the luxury of staying calm or all, the other circumstances. Yeah, thanks for making a point of saying that. Yeah, you mentioned a lot there about the different work styles, and I'm sure a lot of folks will identify with many of the elements that you ticked off. But at the end of the day, it does sound like you're right. It's a lot of new data, and it's hard to really say anything very definitive at this point. I think from Gallup, when I've read some of the stuff they've put out, it sounds like they're aligned with what you've mentioned, that if you're going to do hybrid, for example, it's best at the lowest level and let the teams determine it. And they need to be in sync. It's not like, oh, Peter, you go into the office Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and I go in on Tuesday and Thursday. That's right. Not going to work if we're on the same team, right? Things like this. But boy, it does seem like there are more questions than answers, but that's what we're navigating together. Right. So thank you. Okay, I ask everybody the same question to close things out. So I will ask you, Peter, doesn't have to do with work. It could be whatever you like. What is something that you've learned recently?
So when I stepped down from my last job, I did not have another job waiting. And that was partially circumstance because I had decided when I was going to leave my last job and was busy creating the transition over the course of the last 6 to 12 months and didn't really have time to job hunt. And I really needed a break. I've never taken a break between jobs, and I needed some time to step back. My career, like many people's, just kind of happened to me, right? I took a job and then I took another job, and then I took another job. And after a while, the momentum just carries you in a direction. I needed to sort of get off of that path and say, okay, what do I really love doing? What do I want to do more of? What do I want to do less of? No job is going to be 100%. I love every minute of every day. But what do I do? How do I get there? And so I'm doing some consulting. I'm doing some coaching. I'm doing some volunteer work. But really what I'm learning is how to feel engaged and fulfilled without the structural anchoring of an organizational home, a place that I call my work, right? My work really is now an activity, not a place. And it's kind of episodic. So I also don't have long-term continuity. I'm learning what I like, what I don't like, and what I'm capable of doing. I'm not done learning, but I'm checking in with myself to make sure I'm doing what I'm sort of meant to be doing based on what I love doing. And I'm also doing some volunteer work here to address some of the talent challenges in our industry. Because if you think the talent challenges are hard when you have the United States mainland to work with, try living on an island in the middle of Pacific Ocean that has the highest cost of living of the 50 states, and you realize that there are some big challenges in getting talent here, getting people here to be engaged and challenged and feeling like they have some sense of growth. A lot of the big conferences don't take place here because they're too expensive. So only the organizations that can afford to send people to California or Arizona or New York get that kind of professional development outside of their workplace. So I'm learning a lot of those kind of things that I think, because I've been in institutional roles my whole life, I never really had great insight into. And you begin to realize how smaller nonprofits, especially, really struggle with some of these issues because you have lots and lots of demands and not a lot of resources to meet them.
Thanks for sharing that, Peter, joining us from Honolulu, Hawaii. A beautiful but expensive place, it sounds like. Yes. Peter, for anyone who is interested in seeing what, either through your work or through what you write out there on the internet, where would you like to direct them to go?
Well, LinkedIn is the best place to find me. I'm there every day. And so if you go to LinkedIn and search my name, I'm the only one with my name. Okay. It's a blessing and a curse. And then there's a follow me button. So if you want to follow me, you'll get my posts delivered directly to your feed.
That sounds great. Well, thank you so much for being generous with your time today, Peter. I had a great time with this discussion, and I know a lot of people will get a lot of great insights out of what we talked about. So thank you so much. Appreciate talking with you today.
Thanks for having me, Jason. I enjoyed the conversation.
Hey, thanks everybody for sticking through the interview with Peter. A lot of really good topics we covered in there, and Peter has a wealth of experience to bring to the conversation, and I hope you got something out of it. A quick summary for you all. Reminder that the show is at leadership.voyage on the web. The show's email is startyourvoyage@gmail.com if you want to contact us. And, of course, to please subscribe and rate and review wherever you listen to your podcasts. So let's get to the episode summary today for what we talked through with Peter. A lot of stuff today. First off, what I loved, talking about why does he get up every day? He wants to make sure of three things. One, he wants to make sure that he's doing something that he wants to do every day. He wants to go to work, if you want to think of it that way. Second, he wants to be engaged in something that makes others' lives better. And third, he wants to be doing something that kind of serves his voracious learning, something that meets that need. Well, we talked about people interviewing for jobs. Peter said it was important that you find a company that aligns with your values, an environment that's going to challenge you and be a good cultural fit, and that you'll be reporting to someone who's invested in your growth. Remember that while you're going through that interview process, it's likely the best treatment you'll ever get from that company. Make sure that you approach your job search and job offers with a healthy objectivity. In other words, find a position that fits well enough for you and then work hard to make it really meet your needs. It's unlikely there's just one perfect job for you out there. More than ever, behavioral interviews are the flavor of the day, so be prepared for those. And as an interviewee, make sure you come prepared with questions for the company. It shows curiosity. For search committees that are looking for candidates for open positions, Peter talked about the importance of diversity of perspective from these committees, that it's important that members are present and participatory in the process. We want to see engagement. And although it may sound almost silly, it's very important to have alignment on the job definition amongst all the search committee members. We talked a little bit about bad managers, and Peter almost fought back in saying maybe they're just managers that haven't been coached. He believes anyone can become an effective manager, but maybe they're just missing organizational training. Sometimes change happens too, and that can just affect alignment, and each person handles that in their own way. Talking about culture, a very interesting and perhaps nebulous topic, Peter defined culture as the set of values, practices, norms, rituals that define the soup we all live in when we go to work. Thinking about a toxic culture, which is kind of a subjective term, but when we have patterns of dissatisfaction in toxic cultures, it's usually around lack of trust, lack of transparency, and an inconsistent accountability between different parts or levels of the organization. Usually, Peter said that it's people feeling that information flows right to their manager and stops. That when people feel that way, it's not a great sign for a company culture. So what are some things that we can do? As leaders from anywhere or leaders of teams, we can model the behaviors that we want to see. Create incentives for others to come along with these behaviors. Operationalize your values. Have the courage to confront bad actors, and just generally practice respect for each other. Show compassion. We finally dived into the complicated discussion of hybrid versus remote versus in-person work. There are definitely challenges for the hybrid and remote segments when you talk about meetings and building camaraderie. But maybe hybrid could be the best of both worlds if it is handled deliberately and intentionally. But all in all, perhaps there's not quite enough history or data yet to really be conclusive on this topic of work environments. So there's your quick summary of my conversation with Peter Hayashida. Thank you so much for tuning in, and take care.